They laughed when she walked into the restaurant wearing a jacket with worn elbows and shoes that had seen better winters. They laughed when her hair was pulled into a simple bun and when she asked, in a voice that had softened from years of early mornings and late nights, whether she could sit with them. They laughed when her purse smelled faintly of detergent and coffee, as if the world could be measured by how recently it had been cleaned. They laughed like people who keep score with cruelty, who have rehearsed superiority, so often it becomes a reflex. She did not cry. She had cried before, in the quiet hours when the house was a hollow breathing thing and the TV light made her kitchen look like another country. But tonight she folded the napkin, smoothed the creases with a fingertip, and smiled as if the smile itself were a small, secret defiance. She had been called names, told she was a burden, reminded of every unpaid bill and every explanation she owed for trying to do her best with the very least. She had heard the words of her children, grown and sharp, that cut more than any stranger's insult. The restaurant smelled of rosemary and oil and the kind of warmth people mistake for wealth. The son, who wore his new promotion like armor, leaned back in his chair and told a story about a conference in another city, about a laugh he earned from a man who mattered, as if the story were proof he mattered too. The daughter, with lipstick that never seemed to smudge, clicked her phone and scrolled through curated moments that showed a life of curated perfection. Both of them looked at their mother like she belonged to a past they could edit out. "Why did you have to come?" the daughter asked. Not even a question, but an accusation. The son shrugged. "She said she wanted to see us. She said she was proud." A chorus of small, cruel jokes followed. They made fun of the way she used her napkin, of the threadbare flap on her purse, of the inked, notched receipts she kept in the bottom like talismans of survival. They told each other stories about how they had to carry the weight of embarrassment, how they had to pick up the slack of a mother who never learned to be present in the right kind of way. They never stopped to think of what the word present might mean to someone who had been up at dawn for decades, who had learned to love by making lists and folding shirts, and showing up even when the body was tired and the mind had its own reasons to hide. She smiled again, forever tamponed into her face like a small lamp that refused to go out. When the waiter brought the check, she reached into her purse, withdrew a few crumpled bills, added a card, and placed it on the table. Her hands trembled only a little. Her children rolled their eyes and pretended to search their pockets. She stood, kissed each of them on the forehead with the same tenderness she had given them when they were tiny and shaking from thunderstorms, and left without a scene. No pleading, no begging, no dramatic exit. She left like someone who had been rebuilding a life for so long that she had learned the art of quiet departures. Outside, the night smelled like rain on hot concrete. She walked to the bus stop, her back straight though her shoulders carried years, and when the bus breathed her into its fluorescent belly, the driver nodded, the only person on that whole street who practiced the simple grace of seeing another human being. She sat by the window and watched the city roll past in a ribbon of lights, each one a small, private fire. She thought about the mornings when she had packed lunches for small hands, when she had given up dreams because the rent needed paying. She thought about the way her heart had rearranged itself around the needs of others until there were no corners left for her own desires. Weeks later, life folded into its habitual rhythm. The son moved his family into a new townhouse and took pictures of ratios and angles like proof of stability. The daughter continued her carefully curated climb through events and parties and perfectly filtered faces. They texted their mother occasionally with a polite emoji or a line that said all the things a polite world requires and none of the things the heart needs. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in the kind of envelope that makes you think someone else is thinking about you in a way that matters. It came with a crest they did not recognize and a formal tone that suggested lawyers and estates. The mail slot clicked, and she picked it up like a child finding a coin under a couch cushion. The handwriting on the envelope was neat. Inside, the paper felt impossibly substantial. There was a name, an old friend she had known in a previous life, when hope still smelled like new paint. The letter told of a death, and of a woman who had never married, who had watched their small town with the hungry, tender eyes of someone who kept secrets the way some people keep lists. She had left everything to a stranger named in the letter, a person who had once been saved from an empty bench by a mother's hand. There were legal formalities and tribunal phrases, But the simplest line was the one that lodged under her ribs and would not let go. You have inherited $10 million. When she read the number, her first reaction was a slow, domestic one. She thought about the leaky sink under the kitchen window, the ancient furnace that coughed in winter, the cracked tile in the hallway that always snagged socks. Her mind measured needs the way it had measured them for years. She thought of medical bills that had accumulated like secret weights, of the little things that hurt the household. A heater that failed the winter the youngest had run a high fever, a car that smelled like burned oil and promise. She called a lawyer. She sold the house in secret because she did not want her children to see her old life bulldozed too quickly for the sake of shock. She kept the old photographs in a box with a ribbon and placed the ribbon into a drawer because attachments were quieter that way. She learned about accounts and trustees and taxes. She learned to say the words estate planning without sounding like a person reading someone else's script. She did not shout about her fortune. Mostly she sat at the kitchen table and wrote lists the way she always had. On the first list, she put roofing and heat and health. On the second, she put a scholarship fund. On the third, something she could not yet name. Word traveled anyway. People have noses for wind. A neighbor who once shared sugar and gossip noticed new curtains at the widow's house. A distant cousin who had been out of touch sent a cautious message. The son heard through a co-worker's wife that change had come to the street where their mother had lived. The daughter, scrolling through a feed of people pretending that every life is ordinary, saw a headline in a local paper about a quiet woman whose inheritance had made headlines because of the way she chose to use it. They came back the way vultures circle. It was not a dramatic return at first. The daughter texted a heart and a selfie with a caption that said, "Love you." The son sent a message that said, "Congratulations, proud of you." She answered with the same sentiment, tempering pride with a fierceness that had nothing to do with money. "Come for lunch," she wrote. "Let us talk." She would see the boys and girls who had once been small and sticky-fingered around the table, who had once been the reason she rose at dawn. At lunch, the son arrived with a gift, an expensive bottle with a ribbon that said, "I'm trying." The daughter came with apologies that tasted like rehearsed lines. They sat across from their mother with the confidence of people who believed the world had always been only the size of their achievements. They spoke of budgets, of plans, of how the money could be invested, of how they could create a foundation named after her if she wanted. They spoke like people who had been trained by power to assess everything by yield. She listened. She knew the grammar of money now. She had a list of things she would do with it, and none of them included changing the way she loved. When they suggested the hospital wing donation, she placed a gentle, almost amused hand across the table and said no. When they spoke of an investment fund that would triple within 5 years, she folded the napkin and placed it on her knee. She told them that she had already started. The first surprise came like a small, deliberate kindness. The leaky sink was fixed, the floors were replaced, the house sold, and the new place she bought was modest and bright, with a yard big enough for the roses she had killed and kept trying to resurrect. She opened a community kitchen in the building where she had once worked at night. She funded scholarships for kids who had no one to help them make applications or buy shoes. She donated to a clinic that kept its doors open for those who could not pay. The money moved in ways that were slow and stubborn, like someone planting trees in a drought and trusting the future to remember. It was not enough for her children. They wanted the same kind of public transformation that meant their names would be bracketed in headlines. They wanted to exploit the narrative the way the internet exploits stories, searching for the angle that would make them look generous. They suggested naming things after the family, after them, as if the world operated on a ledger of recognition. She refused. She would not let her life be taught as a lesson in their grandstanding. Their anger turned into greed. They began to call more often, each call a wiretapping of affection for the time when attachment could be monetized. They stopped by unexpectedly, just to check in, with questions about accounts tucked between their sentences like claws. They asked for loans as if the money grew on her like a tree she could shake. They forgot the tenderness she had poured into scraped knees and late-night stories. She sat them down one afternoon in the small, sunlit room of the community center she had helped renovate. No recording, no cameras, no fanfare. Across from them, she placed a folder with documents that she had asked a lawyer to prepare. In it were terms and conditions that looked like a test. The community center needed a director. The scholarship needed oversight. The clinic needed a board. She told them, simply, If you want to be part of this work, there are rules. If you want the money without the work, then leave. They bristled. They could not believe that their mother would require accountability. They had never been asked for more than token appearances and praise. They thought themselves entitled to a share because they were her children. They did not understand that heritage is not solely about money. It is about responsibility, about how a life's private chapters are folded into the public pages. So she set terms that were reasonable in their firmness. Volunteers had to show up before sunrise for 1 month. Board members had to evaluate real applications and visit people in their homes. Those who managed the funds had to take classes in philanthropic ethics. She required, in small print that would have made a lesser lawyer cry, that anyone who wanted a role had to work without payment for a year and show a record of humility. She insisted on verifiable steps: attend community planning, write reflections, meet applicants, listen more than speak. The son saw this as a humiliation. The daughter saw it as an insult to their station. They left in a storm of indignation, promising to take legal action, to contest the will's stipulations. They said things about being trapped, about filial obligations being traded for public theater. They told their friends that their mother had gone mad with generosity. Their friends, for a time, were amused and then uncomfortable, because people like clear lines and their opinions of the family changed with the weather. In the court of public opinion, their mother became a heroine to some and a fool to others. Social media tasted the story like a new spice, the woman who turned down vanity and chose work. Some admired her, some mocked. But in the small rooms of the community center, in the clinic waiting area where a mother hugged her child and could afford antibiotics because of funds that came through without fanfare, there were other measures of success. Appointments kept, children enrolled, a woman who had been given a small loan to restart a food stall, now standing with a better smile. Time softened some of the edges. The son's marriage strained under the pressure of resentment. Money does strange things to the architecture of love. The daughter's flawless feed began to show cracks when a scandal from an old job had a way of surfacing. The world of appearances fractures under pressure. They began to see their mother not as a problem to be solved by more cleverness, but as a person who had chosen a path of quiet consequence. The son watched, one winter, as a man from his old neighborhood got a job because a scholarship program had provided training. He watched a single act of stability create its own small chain of kindness. And for the first time, he felt a shame that was bigger than his need for recognition. He came to her not with a lawsuit, but with a request: teach me. He sat in the same sunlit room and asked, in honest voice, to be part of the center's planning committee, not because he wanted his name on anything, but because he wanted to learn how to do something good without accounting for applause. The daughter, slower to admit anything, volunteered at the clinic. She watched a child's fingers unclench around a small sandwich and felt a strange, unfamiliar pride that had nothing to do with filters or metrics. They did not get absolution with a neat ending. Redemption in real life is messy. There were stumbles and relapses and all the human things that come from being a person raised in a world that taught performance before presence. But the old woman, with her practical lists and her stubborn heart, taught them the terrain of responsibility. She taught by example, by asking difficult questions of those who came to ask for help, by refusing to let the money be a bandage rather than a bridge. Years later, at a small gathering in the community center, the son stood at a podium and read a short speech about public service. He did not mention his mother's inheritance or the cruel nights they had once shared. He said instead that some people come into a community and choose to invest their lives in others. He talked about accountability and dignity, about how giving is less about the giver than about the receiver who is treated like a human rather than a project. People clapped because clapping is what people do. Afterwards, the son walked over to her and kissed the top of her head, the way a child will kiss a parent to seal a private kind of reconciliation. The mother watched the children she had raised move through their own kinds of learning. She kept working. She watched the roses in her yard grow stubborn and green. She kept a small box of photographs in which their faces, once small and sticky, now showed the soft lines of adulthood. She did not need the world to tell her she was valuable. The morning she died, it was quiet and fair. The sun came through the window exactly as if time had chosen one last kindness. At the funeral, people talked about what she had done with money and how she had refused to make it about spectacle. There were tears, not only for the life that had passed, but for the way she had taught others to be better than they had been. The son and daughter, older and more honest, spoke about their mother not as someone to be pitied or used, but as a force of steady care who had refused to be consumed by bitterness. They had humiliated her once, in the bright theater of their own superiority. They had thought they knew her limits. They had missed the quiet reservoirs of dignity that had sustained her. In the end, inheritance was not only a sum of money but a ledger of lessons that unrolled through time. That power is better used when it remembers the small hands it once held. That generosity without accountability can be a show, and that true wealth is often the quiet work done when no one is looking. When they sorted through her papers, among the mundane receipts and the lists of groceries, they found a final list she had written in her careful, small script. At the top it read, simply, love them. Below it, in a different ink, she had written, teach them to love others back. The children folded the paper like a relic and kept it in the box with the photographs. They had humiliated their poor mother without knowing what she carried. In the end, what mattered was not the money they wanted and could not have without work, but the quiet inheritance that cost nothing and everything, a life that taught them how to be human. They learned the hard way that some fortunes are measured not in dollars, but in the way a life bends toward kindness and refuses to be bowed by the small cruelties of the world.